The noise of the bustling city was muffled beyond the windows, and the school corridor stretched out like a long, unseen path leading into the unknown. The newly arrived literature teacher, Mr. Harris, watched the throng of students passing by with a hint of skepticism. He had just turned 35, but here, in this school filled with youthful faces, bold gazes, and boisterous conversations, he felt much older. Harris was accustomed to the strict standards of the high school where he had previously taught. Here, in this new place, everything seemed unfamiliar, lacking the clarity and order he was used to. But at one moment, his gaze lingered on a particular student. She stood slightly apart as if uninterested in the happenings around her. Tall, slender, with curly hair and dark skin, she exuded a mystery and strength rarely seen in someone so young. Her name was Naomi, and Mr. Harris knew this name before he ever spoke to her. It appeared in his rosters, and he often encountered it while grading assignments. In class, Naomi listened attentively, but there was something in her gaze beyond mere interest, something that made Mr. Harris feel uneasy. Her gaze was both gentle and insistent, as if she knew more about him than he was willing to reveal. Several weeks passed, and their interactions grew slightly friendlier. Naomi often stayed after class, asking questions about literature, discussing texts, and occasionally touching on more personal topics. Mr. Harris felt that their conversations became a kind of refuge for him. His wife, Anna, had been occupied in recent months preparing for their baby's arrival, and their own conversations had grown reserved, somewhat dry, and surface level. Nevertheless, he didn't allow himself to think that his relationship with Naomi could go beyond mentorship. That was unacceptable, immoral, and against school rules. But something in her eyes, in the way she looked at him, made his heart beat a little faster. Everything changed one evening after school when Naomi stayed behind to finish a literature project. She stayed longer than usual, and when Harris closed the door behind the last student, only the two of them remained in the room. Silence hung in the air, and he felt the tension between them grow almost unbearable. She looked at him, her eyes deep and serious, and at that moment something inside him shifted. He knew he couldn't let himself give in to temptation, but he felt trapped, as though there was no way out. Harris felt a shiver run through him. He looked down, trying to keep his eyes on the textbooks and the board, but the attraction to Naomi was too strong to ignore. Her warm brown eyes expressed not only curiosity, but something more. Interest, sympathy, even desire. It was all written on her face, though she tried to hide her feelings behind a wide smile and careful questions. "Mr. Harris." Her voice came unexpectedly soft, almost a whisper. "How do you like it here at our school?" He froze, hearing a note of vulnerability in her voice. She looked so honest and sincere in her interest that it unsettled him even more. "It's not bad," he replied, trying to speak confidently, though his thoughts were scattered and far from the conversation. "It's difficult to get used to a new place, but it gets easier over time." Naomi smiled, taking a small step closer. They were standing too close, and Harris knew it, but he couldn't move away. It felt as if the whole world had stopped in that moment, leaving just the two of them. He attempted to refocus, but suddenly felt her touch, a faint but warm touch, like an electric shock running across his skin. "You know I respect you, Mr. Harris?" Her voice was quiet, almost intimate. "No one's ever helped me the way you have." He froze, not knowing how to respond. He knew he should step back, leave, put an end to this ambiguous situation. But something held him in place, as if his will was surrendering to something bigger and beyond his control. "Naomi," he began, searching for the right words. "You need to understand that." Her gaze was so open, it seemed as if she could read his thoughts. But at that moment, the door to the classroom suddenly opened, and another teacher glanced inside, forcing them to quickly step away from each other. An ordinary movement, but now it felt like something close to a transgression. Harris felt a wave of shame mixed with surprise and frustration. Over the next few weeks, they avoided being alone, but every glance, every casual encounter in the hallway only intensified the tension. Harris knew he had to break this invisible bond, but something always stopped him. He thought about his wife, the future baby, and how their lives would soon change, but somehow thoughts of Naomi pushed everything else to the background. One evening, when the school was nearly empty, Harris received a message from Naomi. It was short, yet it carried everything she was afraid to say aloud. "I need to talk to you. It's important." He knew he shouldn't go, but something inside urged him on. Perhaps it was simple human weakness or a need for understanding that he felt so lacking. When they met in an isolated corner of the schoolyard, everything repeated itself. He tried to find excuses, but her presence seemed to paralyze his will. This time, she made no effort to hide her feelings. She moved closer, placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered words that broke down his last internal barrier. "I love you, Mr. Harris. I tried to fight this feeling, but I can't anymore." He knew it was wrong. He knew he should stop and walk away, but he couldn't. That night, he let himself succumb to temptation, breaking all the boundaries he had previously built between them. So began their secret affair, filled with furtive messages, brief encounters, and agonizing anticipation. Harris was tormented by guilt, but each time he saw Naomi, all logic crumbled. These forbidden ties consumed him, forcing him to hide and lie to everyone, including himself. One evening, when he returned home late, his wife Anna was already asleep. Harris knew she was worried about his absences, but he could never explain his frequent lateness. He tried to act as usual, yet more often found himself thinking of Naomi, even when sitting right next to his wife. It felt as though everyone around him had started to suspect, though no one dared ask questions. 6 months had passed since his secret affair with Naomi began. Harris was already accustomed to carefully covering his tracks, constantly checking to make sure no messages were left open and that his expression was unreadable when he looked at his wife. However, he began to notice that Anna looked at him differently, intently, cautiously, as if trying to find invisible threads tying him to something or someone else. Anna had always been observant, noticing the little things and never missing a detail, and although Harris hoped she was simply imagining things, he increasingly felt her scrutinizing gaze. One evening, when he entered the house after another secret meeting, Anna greeted him with a faint chill, something he sensed immediately. "You're late," she said, watching him as he took off his coat. "Got held up at work. Students sometimes forget that teachers have a personal life too." He attempted a smile, but he himself sensed how forced it sounded. Anna smiled faintly in response, but her eyes remained cold and wary. Harris realized he needed to be extra careful, but every time his phone vibrated or he left the house, he felt her intense focus on him. Inside, a growing unease took hold, tightening like a knot of fear and anxiety that became more tense each day. Anna tried not to reveal her suspicions, but her thoughts were already forming a clearer picture. She noticed everything, how his eyes lit up when he received a message, how his mood changed after late nights out, and how he spent less and less time at home. Her love for him remained, yet something else began to grow within that love, an uncertainty, a doubt, feeding on her soul, making her increasingly tense and suspicious. One morning, she couldn't take it anymore. Trying not to be too obvious, she took Harris's phone while he was in the shower. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for or if she would actually find anything, but in her hands was the key to her unease. There was no hard evidence, no passionate messages or obvious hints of betrayal. Harris had been careful not to leave a trail, but Anna noticed a name in his contacts list that was unfamiliar to her. A simple, nondescript name that might not have caught her attention in any other situation, but now it stood out more than ever. Her fingers froze over the screen, her heart pounding faster. She didn't know what she would do next, but one thought firmly took root. She needed to know more. For a few seconds, Anna stared at the phone screen, torn between her desire to find the truth and her fear of what it might reveal. Reason, love, despair, and fear wrestled within her. She almost closed the messages, but something urged her to look through the photos. She instinctively sensed that the answer lay there. Finally, she put the phone down, returned to the kitchen, and tried to calm herself, but an obsessive feeling of anxiety wouldn't let her go. That evening, Harris came home a little later than usual. Though he tried to appear relaxed, Anna sensed his nervousness. He looked around as if expecting his secret to be exposed at any moment. She now had a new weapon, a silent, invisible control over his every move. A week passed, and Anna began to notice more peculiarities. He constantly checked his phone, isolated himself for calls, and his clothes sometimes bore the faintest trace of an unfamiliar scent. Every time he came home late, she pretended to be asleep, yet listened closely to each of his steps. One morning, she took a step she had previously been too afraid to take. Rushing to work, Harris left his phone in the kitchen, and Anna, heart racing, opened the gallery once again. She scrolled through the photos until she stumbled upon an image that took her breath away. It was a picture of a young girl, Naomi. Her face, her posture, her expression, all conveyed a closeness and trust that had no justification. Annie stood, barely breathing, as she realized that this was not just some stranger. This was the very student with whom Harris had been having an affair. A cold chill washed over her as she grasped the depth of their relationship, how her husband had crossed boundaries that were not just rules, but the very foundation of their marriage. At that moment, she felt an unbearable pain, and rage mixed with despair overwhelmed her. That evening, when Harris returned, Anna decided not to let on that she knew. She cautiously began questioning him, her tone light, but her eyes burning with determination. So how's it going with the students? She asked, watching his reaction. Anyone you've gotten especially close to? Harris averted his gaze, his answer sounding hesitant. Well, there are a few talented students I give extra attention to. It's after all part of my job. Anna nodded, holding back a wave of pain and anger, though her cold gaze spoke volumes. Inside, she knew that she would wait no longer and simply observe. She knew the truth, and her patience was nearing its end. Anna suppressed the storm of emotions that had been building within her, yet staying calm was becoming harder with each passing day. She wanted to demand answers, to make him confess, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the fear of what she might hear, or the desire to prepare the ground for the final conversation. In any case, she decided to proceed cautiously, leading Harris to the truth she already knew. The next day, after Harris left for work, Anna decided not to waste any time. She began her investigation with a thorough inspection of every corner of their home, every pocket, every box, even old bills and notes he might have left behind unnoticed. Her persistence paid off when, in the pocket of his coat, she found a paper receipt from a motel. The receipt listed a date and time, the very same day Harris had assured her he was at an important meeting. Anna sat in the kitchen, holding the receipt in her hands, her heart filling with a cold fury. This was more than just a lie. This was a betrayal she had never expected to experience. Her mind swirled with memories of how she had trusted him, accepted his excuses, never suspecting that his distance was a cover for deceit. That evening, when Harris returned, Anna greeted him again with a calm smile, but now there was a distinct coldness in her gaze. She knew he would sense the distance, but she allowed him to think everything was still under control. A few more days passed and Anna continued to act as usual, but inside she was already formulating a plan. She let him go out late, pretending she still believed his explanations, even though it tore her apart. She knew this charade couldn't go on much longer, and she could feel the moment of their final conversation drawing closer. One evening, as Harris relaxed on the couch, Anna quietly approached and sat beside him. She waited for the right moment to suddenly pull out the receipt she had found days earlier and held it out to him. Her eyes were filled with pain and disappointment, and she watched her husband's reaction closely. Harris froze, as if seeing a ghost, and then his face went pale. "Do you want to explain this?" Her voice was quiet but firm, carrying a barely restrained pain. Harris couldn't utter a single word. His silence was answer enough for her, and Anna realized there was no point in further discussion. She slowly rose, holding back tears, and left the room, leaving him alone. That conversation marked the beginning of the end of their relationship, and Anna felt that returning to the way things were was no longer an option. Each day, Anna's condition deteriorated, as though poisoned bitterness was consuming her mind. She could no longer focus on anything except her husband's betrayal and his young lover. All attempts to distance herself, to forget, to retreat into herself were in vain. The pain and betrayal were with her every moment, every second. At night, she lay staring into the darkness, unable to sleep or find even a moment's relief. And soon, her obsessive anguish found a new direction. She found Naomi's number among her husband's contacts. She sat for a long time, staring at the phone screen, her fingers trembling with suppressed anger, but she could no longer restrain herself. After only a moment's hesitation, Anna pressed the call button. At first, Naomi didn't pick up, and Anna hung up, feeling her anger simmering within her. She dialed again, and this time the girl answered. Her voice was quiet, drowsy, as if she had been woken in the middle of the night, which only fueled Anna's rage further. "Do you know who this is?" Anna couldn't keep the bitterness out of her voice. Silence hung on the other end. Naomi was quiet, unable to comprehend what was happening. "I'm Harris's wife," Anna continued with grim satisfaction, feeling the girl freeze in shock. "You thought he'd leave me for you? You thought this would all come without consequences?" Naomi was silent, and in that silence Anna heard fear. It only incited her further, as if it confirmed the power she held over her. She began to call Naomi the most horrible names, the insults spilling out like a long-contained flood. "You think he loves you? Think you're anything more than a toy to him? You're nothing to him. You're worthless. He'll regret ever looking at you." Anna hung up, but her anger didn't subside. The next morning she called again, no longer caring about the time. Naomi answered, her voice tinged with anxiety, but it didn't stop Anna. She didn't give the girl a chance to respond, filling the call with threats, making her believe that her life would be destroyed. Her threats became harsher, her tone colder with each new call. With every new threat, with every insult, Anna felt a strange sense of relief, as if this despised person was to blame for every blow to her own heart. Over time, Anna didn't just call. She began sending Naomi messages filled with venom and hatred. Her words were cold and precise, like a blade cutting flesh. Anna knew she was wounding her deeply, forcing her to feel the same pain she herself had endured. This cruel game became her obsession, and every time Naomi didn't respond, Anna would call even more persistently. In her mind, a thought took root, that only through vengeance could she find peace. And this thought grew within her, finally poisoning her completely. One evening, as Harris came home late, he saw her with a shadow over her face that he hadn't seen before. That night, Annie stood in the dim light of the living room, and her eyes burned with uncontrollable hatred. Harris stopped in the doorway, feeling the weight of her gaze, a gaze that held nothing but icy madness and darkness. Anna seemed like a stranger. Her face was frozen in a mask of suppressed anger and pain, and her gaze pierced him to his very core, filling the room with a sense of inevitable threat. Weeks had passed since Anna began terrorizing Naomi with calls and messages full of hatred. She left the girl no chance for peace. With every ignored call or silence, Anna only grew more incensed, repeating her threats with increasing cruelty. Her words became harsher, and every message, every call drained Naomi of hope. "I'll destroy you," she would hiss when Naomi begged her to stop. "Your future will be crushed, and fear will be your only companion. No one will help you. Don't even hope." Hearing the girl's silence on the other end, Anna felt triumphant. But this victory wasn't enough. Her thirst for revenge continued to consume her thoughts. She saw Harris every day, and each of his glances only fueled her rage further. She watched his every move. His voice grated on her. Each gesture and every step seemed to remind her of the pain he had caused. One evening, Harris went into the bathroom, tired and drained, hoping to find some peace there. Anna watched him close the door and suddenly realized that this was her chance. She already held a knife in her hand, and the cold steel in her fingers felt like long-awaited release. She quietly approached the bathroom door, listening to the sound of water running down the shower tiles. She paused in front of the mirror, glancing at her reflection for a moment. In her eyes, there was no longer doubt or mercy, only cold determination. She opened the door, and her silhouette lingered in the doorway like a shadow. Harris turned, seeing her standing there with the knife in her hand, and pure terror crossed his face. "Anna, what are you doing?" He stepped back, but it was already too late. She took a step forward without saying a word. He screamed, but Anna couldn't hear him. She saw only the image of a traitor, one who would finally get what he deserved. The knife struck him over and over until the bathroom was filled with blood and silence. When it was over, Anna stood there, breathing heavily. Her nightgown soaked in blood, her face cold and expressionless. The sense of relief didn't last long. The obsession that had poisoned her mind only grew deeper. And soon, Anna found herself heading to Naomi's house as if on autopilot. She walked the empty streets, clutching the bloody knife in her hand, her gaze distant and hazy. In her nightgown, shrouded in darkness and her own madness, she approached Naomi's home, and at that moment, passers-by saw her in the glow of a streetlight. People stopped, shocked, and one of them screamed, noticing the knife still gripped in Anna's hand. Her face was blank, lifeless, as if she were a ghost. The blare of police sirens shattered the night's silence, and soon officers surrounded her. She didn't resist as they placed her in handcuffs. Her gaze was empty. There was no anger, no pain, only indifference. She stood on the empty street, engulfed in the abyss of her own madness as the police led her away, leaving behind a trail of nightmares she herself had created. After Anna's arrest, her life became a series of monotonous days, filled with isolation and inner reflections. She was placed in a care facility under observation, surrounded only by white walls, dim lighting, and rare visits from doctors. Her pregnancy added to the complexity. Each examination was conducted under close supervision, and Anna knew that her life would now take a completely different path. Anna rarely spoke to anyone. Her thoughts seemed distant, as if she was trying to find meaning in this new, unfamiliar world. Occasionally, she felt faint movements from the baby, bringing her back to reality and reminding her of an important role yet to come, that of a mother. These moments sparked a flicker of regret and the realization that change was inevitable. Her condition remained stable, though doctors recommended long-term therapy to help her cope and adapt to her new reality. Over time, Anna realized she would need support and understanding to start a new chapter in her life. The doctors informed her that the baby might require temporary guardianship while she completed her treatment. She understood and hoped that one day she could give her child all she herself had been unable to find. When the day of delivery came, Anna felt both a sense of anticipation and an inner calm. The child was placed in care, and Anna faced a long road of recovery ahead. Yet, in her heart, a desire awakened. a desire to find new purpose and meaning. After the events surrounding her teacher's murder, Naomi's life changed forever. Her quiet, peaceful world suddenly collapsed, and she was left facing feelings of guilt, pain, and loneliness that became her constant companions. She tried to return to her usual school life, but every day reminded her of what had happened. Every glance from teachers and students was filled with suspicion and indirect accusations. Naomi felt that everyone at school knew about her connection with Mr. Harris, even though no one said it out loud. Teachers treated her with caution, while classmates watched her with curiosity and judgment. She felt as if she was constantly under scrutiny, as though every step she took was being analyzed and discussed. All of this intensified her sense of guilt, making it impossible to escape her past. Initially, Naomi tried to find solace in her friends, but they also began to distance themselves. They couldn't understand her, couldn't share her pain, and she couldn't tell them the full truth. Feeling isolated, she became closed off and detached, consumed by her inner turmoil. Gradually, Naomi began to lose interest in her studies. Her grades started to drop, and the days blurred into a monotonous and colorless flow. The incident haunted her even at night. She was plagued by nightmares, reliving moments connected to Mr. Harris and his death over and over again. These dreams reminded her of the past, of emotions that once seemed so significant, but ultimately led to ruin and tragedy. Her once rebellious feelings had been replaced by constant anxiety and regret. Naomi's parents noticed her state and tried to support her, but their efforts were in vain. She couldn't fully open up to them, as too much was tied to her secret and inner pain. Eventually, they suggested she see a therapist, and while she initially resisted, she eventually agreed. Therapy became a slow, painful process for her. She couldn't trust the therapist right away, but gradually she began to open up, talking about her feelings of loss and the emotions that led her to these consequences. With each session, she learned to come to terms with her story, no longer hiding from her past or from herself. Over time, Naomi began to find the inner strength to move forward. Her wounds hadn't fully healed, but she was learning to live with them, understanding that her life wasn't over and that there was a chance for healing and a new path ahead. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more thrilling and shocking tales. There's plenty more to come. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.